Welcome to News from the Roots. Today is Monday, July 9th, 2018. I'm Avram Friedman, and this morning, once again, we have Enrique Gomez, president of the Jackson County NAACP. A couple of announcements. Tomorrow, July 10th at 6 o'clock in the evening, the NAACP will be holding a commemoration of the passage of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, in which the slaves were freed and created. Actually, it was it gave freed slaves the rights of citizens, and among other persons. That event will there is a $10 entrance fee, or we're asking for a $10 donation. It'll be held at the Family Resource Center in Webster. Tickets can be obtained at City Lights Bookstore or at the door, assuming that there is room. I understand there's a capacity of 100 people in that building, and if that's exceeded, we won't be able to admit any more people. On Thursday, the Canary Coalition is holding its annual membership meeting at the new Community Service Center on Skyland Drive. It's in the same building where the Driver's License Bureau is, the DMV, and the Board of Elections. Brand new, they have remodeled the inside. It's quite beautiful. There's natural solar lighting in there, and apparently they have a beautiful new conference room with facility for showing movies and slideshows and things like that. So it's free for the public to use as well. You need to reserve it at the Cooperative Extension Agency, which has their office in that building as well. So that is from 6 to 8 p.m. on Thursday, and the public is invited. There will be free pizza and snack foods and drinks. And incidentally, the $10 fee for the NAACP event also includes a buffet salad dinner, I believe.
Salad, and there'll be some munchies as well too, such as brownies.
And there will be a guest speaker at that event, the NAACP 14th Amendment meeting. Dr. Elizabeth Gillespie McCrae will be speaking. She's the author of Mothers of Massive Resistance.
Yeah, I have a copy. Just like everybody, your listeners can, your audience can see Mothers of Massive Resistance, White Women and the Politics of White Supremacy by Dr. Elizabeth Gillespie McCrae.
Yeah. And one other announcement, immediately following News from the Roots this morning, we're going to be watching a conversation about racism. We had Stella Moore, Lucy Christopher, and the host Olivia Hicks speaking about racism, and a very, very interesting conversation. It's interesting to hear the various perspectives. Stella Moore is a black woman, and Lucy Christopher is a white woman, and as is Olivia Hicks. And they spoke about how people relate to each other, and some of the hidden aspects of white privilege, and just the different experiences of people dealing with racism from a different perspective. Anyway, a very worthwhile conversation, and a timely one, I think. So, Enrique, we're coming up on this anniversary of the 14th Amendment. What are the implications of the 14th Amendment? How did that change America, and how does has it ever really come to fruition? You know, has the 14th Amendment ever actually taken effect in this country?
That's an interesting question. Well, it turns out that the anniversary is today. July 9th of the year 1868 was the date in which this amendment was ratified by Congress. So this essentially is one of the Reconstruction Amendments. Amongst the first section of that particular that particular article essentially grants citizenship to all people who were born or naturalized in the United States, which means that people that were former slaves could be given their right to citizenship, including the right to vote. And of course, this applied to men. It didn't apply to women at the time. Another thing that it did is that it essentially apportioned representatives based upon the number of whole persons. If you remember your U.S. history from back in high school, before that, a show of a compromise between the North and the South in terms of apportioning representatives had slaves not count as whole persons, but as 2/3 of a person for the purpose.
3/5.
Oh, 3/5. That's right. Three-fifths of a person for the purposes of apportionment. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So yes, so you have this, and in terms of how it changed that, it certainly granted citizenship to men, and essentially opened the path by which people could imagine other people be granted citizenship rights as well, eventually including women, eventually including Native Americans. And so, to a certain extent, it was true. It was one of those things that was undermined by various means. One of the ways it was undermined is by effectively voting suppression, enacting poll taxes, doing any number of things that would actually make it harder for people to actually vote. And the work of the NAACP when it comes to voting rights kind of goes like this. Essentially, is you go back to the 14th Amendment. As far as I know, every time the NAACP legal teams, going as far back as the founding of the NAACP in 1909, turned to the 14th Amendments for its arguments as to the basis of whether blacks and or minorities would be allowed to vote. So, to a certain extent, it was sort of enacted. One of the things that you see, though, is that, and this is something that showed up at the last conference of the state NAACP here in North Carolina. One of the sessions was a presentation by Leonard Zeskind. That's Zeskind. He wrote in 2009 a book called Blood and Politics, and essentially it tracks the rise of white nationalism from the margins into the mainstream. And in his presentation, he was pointing out that one of the many things that they have been arguing in the margins in the white nationalist movement had to do with show of undoing all of these Reconstruction amendments, with a special focus on the 14th Amendment. It is a headache for them because if they are trying to establish a white homeland and white purity, seeing all these immigrants come in, having their children in U.S. soil, and those children being granted citizenship, that's because of the 14th Amendment. So undoing the 14th Amendment for them would be the way of undoing that, as well as potentially chipping away the rights of citizenship to African Americans as well and or minorities. So there's focus as they do their rise is strategize about ways in which they could repeal the 14th Amendment. And the thing about this is that a couple of years ago, just the idea of something as fundamental as this being repealed in the U.S. jurisprudence would be absolutely preposterous. In the current landscape, though, you do have to sober up a little bit and assess the likelihood that might actually happen. So it's just a matter of just assessing. In view of the fact that they've been very, very focused on that, very focused on that, we at the NAACP, at least at the state level, have made an effort to actually educate the public about the 14th Amendment. And to, given the present context of the immigration debates that we have, and to essentially kind of have this celebration and observance of this, as opposed to just yielding the space to white nationalists and saying, no, this is an important part of who we are as a country. This is part of our foundational document of how we operate in this country. You cannot have the United States as you and I know it presently without this amendment. So let's take a moment to celebrate, to observe that people have citizenship rights.
There's no question that I think the 14th Amendment was a considerable step forward in the evolution of this country in broadening rights. But there was a great area of contention when the 14th Amendment was passed. particularly by the women's rights movement, because the women's rights movement have been fighting for the right for women to vote and become full citizens since prior to the Civil War.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there was a great deal of resentment by some in the women's movement that the freed slaves were given the rights of citizenship before they were. And that's one of the things that Elizabeth Gillespie McCrae is going to speak about, the roots of white supremacy in the women's movement.
Yeah.
A very interesting talk. I heard her speak in Bryson City about this. And anyway, it's interesting to see how movements have evolved and how what was considered progressive in the late 1800s and early 1900s compared to what is considered progressive today.
Well, one of the things, for instance, that Cornel West's show talks about is that essentially the story of the United States is the story of an ever-widening circle of who we recognize as American and who we grant citizenship rights as well. So this is, I would say, any part of the history that is about expanding that circle is something that should be celebrated, knowing that there's never a stopping point. You essentially are sort of expanding that.
And it doesn't always go in one direction. Sometimes it shrinks a little bit.
Sometimes it shrinks.
And then it comes back out again, But in general, the trajectory is for it to expand. Sure.
So, Truth to the Audience, Mothers of Massive Resistance, that is the book by Dr. McRae. I'm still in the process of reading it, so I haven't gone all the way through, so I sort of spent some time with it. So essentially, this work, one of its contributions is essentially to point out that in the American South, you cannot think of, for instance, the role of white women in enforcing or maintaining the Jim Crow regime as being sort of like passive participants or sort of just operating in the margins under the dominance of men. Turns out that you could make a case with many instances that women took an active role in maintaining the Jim Crow South after Reconstruction, and they were also part of sort of organizing the resistance to the civil rights movement and civil rights legislation. And part of it had to do with this, as I understand the work of Dr. McRae, and that is that when you look at the Jim Crow South, you're essentially looking at police state. It's a police state in the sense that activities of groups have to be monitored. But also segregation is really expensive in terms of administrative operations, bureaucracy, in terms of enforcement, in terms of monitoring. Basically, any time that you have a regime that is systematically denying people rights or systematically denying people access to the resources that they need in order to improve the quality of their lives in the form of income, in terms of land, in terms of resources, in terms of education, when you see all of that, it is an expensive proposition. And the thing about this is that there were enough men in order to actually enforce that. So women were actually brought in as part of enforcement for a couple of reasons. One of them, women were essentially in charge of, were the teachers, right? And also they were the ones that essentially delivered babies, right? There were 3 times as many doulas or what's the word that I want to use? Were essentially midwives, as they were doctors that could actually deliver babies. So it was their job actually to essentially document the racial background and makeup of that, and that became more entrenched when you essentially eliminated the entire racial category. For instance, the mulattoes, the mixed race. After at the turn of the 20th century, you essentially had to classify people as essentially white or black, with Indians as being kind of like enmeshed into that category of black or colored. So you had the separation, and you essentially, in order for you to maintain that white racial identity, you need to be able to document, how far back your ancestors came from Europe as opposed to Africa. You have to be able to do that, and as a result of this, you have the ability of women to have quite a bit of power and control over the lives of colored white men and women by being able to do that. Another thing that happens is that women were, and this is talking about gender biological essentialism now, they were deemed to have a greater capacity than men in terms of recognizing mixed race heritage in children and people. Right, because they were teachers, they could sort of document, the whether mixed race, quote unquote, mixed race kids were essentially mentally, intellectually deficient, and that's one of the premises behind it. And of course, if you set up a study to find intellectual, educational deficiencies in any child, if you come from the premise to begin with that they're deficient, you will find those deficiencies. Right? Another thing that happens is that you have an increased number of women that were getting a college education. Right? And the thing about this is that there are not essentially jobs for them to actually get that. So being part of this state of enforced racial separation had to do that. The last part of this also had to do with the fact that women could essentially articulate for a larger population the reasons why separation of the races need to happen. They were the ones that were able to articulate in the form of education, in terms of living spaces, to each other, and you have the rise of some very powerful personalities that essentially were able to explain and use develop certain rhetorical devices that held sway in not just in the South, but essentially across the country, right? So, for instance, when you have resistance of busing after Brown's Board of Education in places like Boston, and white communities were organizing about that. Where did they turn to? They turned to their sisters in the South for essentially ways in which that could be enforced, or could be resisted effectively. And you see, for instance, the rise of this device of the use of the term family, to do that. One of the things that Dr. McRae does in her book is that her contribution, she writes about, feels is that it is important to actually be able to intellectually separate someone who is a conservative and someone who is not racist but a segregationist, right? Because you would see people across the political spectrum at the time. Okay, you could be a liberal and you could be a segregationist. You could be a conservative and you could be a segregationist. You could be a Democrat.
And the white supremacists.
Yes, and you could be a Democrat and you could be a Republican. You could be independent. And sometimes you wear all three, right? And you follow your trajectory, depending upon where we're at. So this idea of women being white women sort of being passive accessories to the entire segregationist state of the Jim Crow South is something that should be questioned as well.
Something else I've recently learned, which was interesting about the early women's movement, is that they were vehemently anti-abortion.
Yeah, well, yeah.
And that was considered progressive at the time. And the women's movement was primarily responsible for prohibition as well.
Yes. No,
so it's interesting how times have changed and how our perception.
And one argument for the women's vote, at least in the South, is that by having white women vote at greater numbers than African American. Black women would, they would essentially dilute the white vote in the South. So that was actually one of the arguments for white women getting the vote in the South.
Getting the vote in the South. That's very interesting. Huh. Yeah. Another aspect of that I found very interesting. Yesterday, actually, I went to the Museum of the Cherokee Indian in Cherokee, and I've been there before, but they're always changing it. And it's a very interesting museum, incidentally, and I recommend it to anybody. The relationship to the American Indian and citizenship, and in fact, in the 14th Amendment, there are some exceptions made. I thought it'd be worthwhile to read through it, actually.
Sure.
To read through the 14th Amendment, just so that the viewing audience understands everything that was in that. There are 5 sections to the 14th Amendment. The first section is all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, and property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. So that's section 1. And the most noteworthy thing here, of course, is that apparently they don't define women as persons.
Yeah.
Because women are not included in this, even though it specifies that no person shall be denied. But going further, section 2, representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed. So there's this differentiation between Indians that are taxed, and I wonder if that means there had been some tribes that had surrendered, I suppose.
Yeah.
And those tribes were considered persons, but Indians that were not surrendered, I'm not exactly
they have not yielded their sovereignty.
Yeah.
There are tribes that yielded their sovereignty. There are other tribes that have never yielded their sovereignty.
I think there's just the Seminoles. I think they're the only remaining tribe that have not surrendered. But any Indian that's taxed now has these rights as well. But when the right to vote at any election for the choice of electors for President and Vice President of the United States, representatives in Congress, the executive and judicial officers of a state, or the members of the legislature thereof is denied to any of the male inhabitants of such state, being 21 years of age and citizens of the United States, or in any way abridged, except for participation in rebellion or any other crime, the basis of representation therein shall be reduced in the proportion which the number of such male citizens shall bear to the whole number of male citizens 21 years of age in such state. So this is where they first differentiate. First of all, they say male citizen.
Yeah.
This, I think, and I think maybe this is overlooked very often when we're looking at the 14th Amendment. At first, there was there was an unlimited number of members in the House of Representatives. The original Constitution said that there should be one representative for every so many I think it's 400,000 people. Or something like that, and if that were the case today, we'd have something like 20,000 members of Congress. So they had to limit the number of members in the House, and I think that that's what this is doing, although it doesn't specify the number of this. That's one of the things that this is doing, and it's saying basically that that every male has to be counted, with the exception of those who have participated in rebellion or some other crime, and that the numbers would be would count in proportion the proportion would exclude those people who are discounted, those who participated in rebellion, and the state, in other words, does not benefit from the people who are not being counted as citizens because they've committed a crime of rebellion or such. Section 3, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state, who have previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 in each house, remove such liability. So this is basically saying that anyone who participated in the Civil War is not
Is not allowed to serve.
is not allowed to serve. But then how did they choose members? Oh, so maybe that's during Reconstruction. That's why at that point you had a lot of carpetbaggers and people and black people who were freed slaves who became representatives and senators, and that I suppose ended when everybody died, or when Congress passed two-thirds.
Essentially you need to have an entire generation in order to kind of like rebuild, particularly the white leadership in the South. That whole experience had to go through.
Okay. And then Section 4, the validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law, including debts incurred for payments of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned. But neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States, or any claim for the loss of emancipation of any slave, but all such debts, obligations, and claims shall be held illegal and void. So this is essentially saying not only are the slaves freed, but nobody is going to be compensated for the ownership of a slave, as if they had lost property, in other words.
And also all debts incurred by any state in the old Confederacy that rebelled against the U.S. Essentially are null and void. So nobody's going to get any money for rebelling against the United States. But the United States, its debts and obligations are recognized for fighting to maintain its integrity.
And the Congress shall, Section 5, Congress shall have power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. Okay. So, and again, this is very interesting. I mean, we consider the Constitution the Bible of our country, basically. I mean, this is the governing principles of our country. Any laws that are passed subsequent to an amendment of the Constitution are supposed to conform with properties of that amendment. But that hasn't actually been the case, as you point out. There have been ways legislated to circumvent the provisions of the 14th Amendment, such as the poll tax.
Yes, and anything that operates like a poll tax, to a certain extent, having requesting having an ID, so like an ID in order to vote,
which is where I was kind of going with this.
And also, for instance, that shows up in discussion of the census, because in order to apportion representatives, you need to have a population count according to a census by the Constitution. It needs to be carried on a regular basis. And I remember the last time that we had a census, there were discussions about, whether the census should also include any kind of statistical analysis in order to assess the accuracy of the plain count of individuals, of people submitting their census reports or surveys, and people actually being visited. And it's showing up again. It's showing up again in the national discourse. Why? Because, for instance, when the Trump administration is interested in including a citizenship question, as it sounds from the offset as being sort of like an innocuous question to have. but the way that it would operate in the field is that people are less likely to would be less likely to return their census surveys, and will be less likely to talk to census taker if they feel that that information could be used against them, especially by the government. So essentially, it would be a way of undercounting areas where there's a high level of immigrants. So it would be so that would be a way in which you kind of like suppress the political power. And as it is right now, things are actually rather lopsided. I mean, someone voting in Idaho, their vote really does count much more strongly because you need fewer votes there in order to elect a representative and a senator compared to a place like a state like California or Texas or Florida. And so it creates this imbalance. And of course, the votes are apportioned according to in the electoral college. You have this weakness over there. So you have this imbalances inherent within the system that we have over there, but they can be magnified to the advantage of one party.
Sure. And that which is exactly happening through the gerrymandering process.
Yes.
In addition to what you just said, the gerrymandering process further imbalances that.
And when the NAACP and our partners, the ACLU, anybody who is working on voting rights, when we go to courts, show the foundation of these arguments are essentially the 14th Amendment.
The 14th Amendment. And of course, now, the General Assembly in North Carolina is currently doing what many are calling legislation through constitutional amendment. I think they're offering 6 constitutional amendments to the voters in this coming election, which is just completely unheard of. It used to be that offering a constitutional amendment was a rare occurrence, but now they're using that mechanism to overcome court decisions that have ruled against, for instance, the voter ID law that was passed and overruled by federal court. And it's a very clever way of doing it, because the argument is, well, if you go to the airport, you need a photo ID. If you want to buy an airplane ticket, if you want to get a library card, you need a photo, and all of these different things. But I think that what's being missed in that argument, or the misrepresentation of that argument, is that all these things, flying, driving in a car, getting a library, these are all privileges, whereas voting is a constitutional right of all citizens. And so it's not the same thing.
It's not the same thing, yeah. And just for a record, what we're seeing this coming November in North Carolina, voters are going to have an unusually long ballot. With lots of language as well, and this might be maybe the subject of a further show, for people to kind of sit down and sort out. So currently there are 6 amendments to the North Carolina Constitution that are going to be coming up. One amendment is a tax cap. The other is something called victims of crime. The third amendment is hunting and fishing, a constitutional amendment essentially stating that people do have a right to hunt and fish. I didn't realize that I needed an amendment. We needed an amendment to
I don't see where that's been challenged, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of odd, but you can also imagine that people are going to come out to the polls because
and I
of
think
that.
that's the purpose, is to get people to come
the
out
polls.
to the polls.
Certain demographic to show up to the vote, to vote. The fourth amendment is essentially a constitutional amendment on requiring a photo ID. Now, the 4th District Federal Court back in 2016 identified that photo ID as well as several other things that were passing what we call the monster voter suppression law back in 2010 or 2012. I'm having a blank here, but essentially say that many of these things were implemented so that with surgical precision, that's their choice of words, surgical precision suppress the vote of minorities, particularly African Americans. The Fifth Amendment, essentially you have a nonpartisan show of judicial apportionment, and then the sixth is you're going to have a nonpartisan board of elections. But one way to show of interpret many of these things is that you are trying to diminish the power of the executive, of the office of the governor, in apportioning many of these things, and have General Assembly have more power. Thing about this is that in our current landscape, we have split government in North Carolina. We have a Democratic governor, and we have Republican dominated this. So this idea of using the Constitution or injecting amendments so that a particular party in power in one branch of government extend its power locally, it's actually quite alarming. So it certainly would be worthwhile to have a show so that our listeners, viewers can actually see more of what we're talking about.
And I think it's important to explain that one of the reasons that's so egregious about the Board of Elections is when you vote for the governor, when we vote for the governor, it's the entire population of the state that votes for the governor. And the governor's race cannot be gerrymandered.
Yeah, you can. But
and so the governor represents the voice of all the people, whereas the districts within the legislature can be gerrymandered and manipulated in the manner that we've seen. So to give that power to the General Assembly is to take away a voice of the entire population of people.
Yeah, and this essentially stresses why we need to have a non-partisan, very well thought out, structured board in charge of creating electoral districts in the state, as opposed to be something that a particular party in power gets to show of design every 10 years or so. So I don't know have you had Chris Cooper in your show? I don't know if you have. He's a professor, Dr. Chris Cooper, of political science. That might be someone that might be worthwhile to have. He and other people across the country are studying this show of the idea of gerrymandering and coming up with potential solutions to the gerrymandering problem. This is something that even happens in other countries, not just here as well. But here it's particularly egregious because of the power of the the structure that we have in designing elections. We're not like Mexico, where someone votes directly for a president. We have the electoral college, this very weird construct, as well as show of all this partitioning account districts that can be just designed so that it is the legislatures that pick their constituents rather than the other way around. So you have the problem, according to the Supreme Court, the problem is this, is that you need to, districts should be continuous as well as they're compact, without any kind of guidance as to what makes continuity or what's compact. And this is a part where I, as someone who has been trained in math and science and all that, I'm actually kind of interested because we're talking about the problems of topology, right? Is that what is a compact district? Why is something that is relatively has a fair representation of the geography and the population on the ground, whereas something that's very long and convoluted, where you have various communities that are disconnected, and where you can set it up so a particular group wins overall several times. So that is something that's sort of worthwhile to sort of.
That it would be good to have. We did cover the Fair Vote Town Hall that took place.
That's
in
right.
Hayward
Yes, and I think that he was one of the speakers
over
there.
Of the people there.
So that's actually it might be sort of worthwhile to even bring that into the stream periodically. But you have we're talking of course to Chris Cooper. His sense is that it is I don't feel it should be. It should be an issue of having some kind of unambiguous, very specific definition of what it's meant to be compact as well as continuous. Topologically, mathematically, it should be something that should be rather straightforward. What he's interested though is this concept called an efficiency gap. An efficient gap is essentially a measure of how much harder it is for one party as opposed to another to devote the resources needed and the votes needed in order to win. So when you create sufficient districts with a high enough efficiency gap, one party can confidently, regularly win overwhelming majorities in legislature, whether it be the state or whether at the national level. So certainly something that does need to be explored. So we are in the need of having a very well thought out non-partisan board in charge of periodically drawing the districts over redistricting.
And there have been examples of good redistricting processes that have been developed in the country, in Iowa and California and others, where there are checks and balances within the process. It's not just one partisan body that is developing the plan. So the mechanisms exist. It's the political will to get there.
Absolutely.
That is absent. I just want to get back to the voter ID law again and the constitutional amendment. I think it's important to explain why this creates a hardship and why it amounts to voter suppression to require a voter ID for voters. Something that has never happened before in this country since except in the last decade, I guess, in many states now, where there are mostly the southern states that have been requiring voter IDs, and why it's an obvious power grab and a manipulation of the voting process to require a voter ID. It sounds innocuous enough. Well, why shouldn't people have a voter ID? It's not that hard to get a photo ID. Well, it is for some people, and also they have, at least in the law that was overturned, they attempted to limit the type of photo ID. You could only get it from a government agency, and a student ID didn't count, for instance. It's a deliberate attempt to discourage some populations from voting. And I think it's important to understand that. It's difficult for elderly people who can't drive to go out and get a voter ID. It's difficult for working people to get to a DMV office during working hours because they're working. They have to take time off from work to go and do it. There has to be a very deliberate attempt to do that, and it shouldn't be. It should be easy to vote. In many countries, they hold elections on Sunday.
Yes.
So that it's easier for most of the population. Why do we hold elections on Tuesdays?
Well, it's in the Constitution, actually. Do you know the answer to that question?
I don't know the answer to that question, but why isn't it a national holiday?
It should be.
To allow people, the maximum number of people to vote. And, because this country was born as an aristocracy.
Yes, yes.
And so it was easy for people who weren't working people to go out and vote on a Tuesday. It didn't matter what day of the week it was. But for working people, it's difficult to do that, and it's difficult to take the time and to remember to go and get the right voter ID, that is required. So it's, not everybody can get a driver's license. Not everybody can make it over to the driver's license bureau, and there is a cost. Well, although they're claiming it'll be free to do that, there's still a cost in terms of getting there, taking the time and getting over there. Sometimes the DMVs are, especially in rural communities, are located at some distance, on a rural route someplace. That's not easy to get to. There may not be any public transportation to get there. So we're talking about disenfranchising potentially hundreds of thousands of people, mostly low income, people of color, students, populations that generally vote differently than the current majority
in the state, yeah.
in the state.
Well, it's because I know I've had conversations online about people. People point out, well, other countries have something called voter ID, right? For instance, Mexico has, you cannot vote without a voter ID.
Is it a photo ID?
It is a photo ID, yes. And then a question, why is it that the United States can't, in fact, get something very similar to that as well? It's sort of like a fair question. The way to think about it is that a country like Mexico, a country like France, many of those countries essentially are run by the Napoleonic Code. They have a legal system and constitutions not based on sort of like the English Magna Carta sort of method of sort of like jurisprudence methods, philosophies of jurisprudence and all that. The way that elections, for instance, in France and Mexico are sort of run is that essentially are top down. You essentially have a national, it's what's called the National Institute of Elections in Mexico. I don't know what it's called in France, but essentially you have a national body, sort of independent appointment, that essentially is responsible for administering, designing the process, and also the way of administering voter ID. And the thing about this is that they are set up in such a way, so as to make the whole process of registration as well as obtaining a voter ID sort of uniform and as painless as possible, sort of cost-free, all of that. So they have that system. Here in the United States, we have so many uneven applications of law and jurisprudence. So, for instance, here in North Carolina, and I was just trying to sort of like look up the name, but the name didn't come up. I'm sure it's in my notes here somewhere. Essentially, we have the case of one African American woman who is, I believe, in her 90s now, who had the whole experience of having to obtain a voter ID. The issue here is that she did not have the birth records to establish her citizenship according to the 14th Amendment, right? She did not have that. She essentially had to take several trips, to her DMV, at a cost of several dozens of hours just of drive time in order to go through the process of establishing her citizenship in order to obtain that voter ID. Why? Because she was born at home without someone to actually do that record in the depths of the Jim Crow South. So the fact that we have this historical presence of sort of unevenness makes it unlikely that not everybody here will be able to furnish the documents in order to get government issue ID. So there what you want to do is, but since we're not looking here for a privilege, we're looking here for a right? You want to err in the side of recognizing a right. And also, one of the justifications behind voter ID is to essentially prevent voter fraud. However, there have been millions of votes cast in North Carolina, and people have failed to essentially present any substantial evidence of more than just a couple of instances of voter fraud that were beyond just accidental. So essentially it creates a narrative of massive fraud and massive distrust when there is no evidence at all that that's in fact needed. So essentially you will be disenfranchising potentially hundreds of thousands of people in order to solve a problem that's not really there.
And something that's not talked about much is that there is significant deterrent for anybody to engage in voter fraud. Because
yes, absolutely.
If you are caught voting under false pretenses, if you're not a citizen or if you don't have the right to vote, you could go to jail for it's a felony, and you could go to jail for 5 years or more. In fact, there was recently a case in which a very unjust case, a woman who had just gotten out of jail. But she was still on probation, and her mother urged her to go and vote, and she went innocently.
Yeah, without knowing.
And she was a
Right.
citizen. She had just she had a felony and she served her time, but now she was out on parole, and she was they stopped her from voting, and she was given a 5-year sentence, which is horrible, I think.
Yeah, and absolutely. And when you think about it, if you're going to perpetrate massive voter fraud, right, so like organized pay thousands of people to go and vote. First, it's a stupid way of doing it for many of for what you pointed out, but also it's just costly. It is so much easier to essentially hack into any of these diabolic computers or into any of these voter systems, and we know this happens. We know, for instance, there's evidence that foreign agents have tried to hack into the state board of elections of several states, their system, in order to obtain information. So the possibility is it wouldn't take too much to actually create this show of hidden, process, and all you have to do is identify essentially machines where the vote is roughly equal with one side and the other. It just takes one line of code inserted into it to say, it's like, okay, well, we know that this guy won and this lady didn't, so we're just going to kind of like, but the vote is close enough, so let's just kind of like switch the numbers from this guy to that lady, so that it becomes like this when it gets reported. It wouldn't be too hard to actually do.
And there's a lot of speculation that's happened already.
That
in 2000 in Florida and
yes.
2004 in Ohio.
Yes, so that would be the way to do it. And yet we have people are perpetrating this essentially myth at this point of massive number of immigrants coming in and throwing the elections up to the side. And it creates an environment of distrust of institutions, of distrust of the process, to be essentially repeating those things without any evidence at all whatsoever to back it.
Yeah. Right, and so to effectively prevent non-existent voter fraud, the new laws have suppressed the vote for hundreds of thousands of people, and extremely undemocratic, and just the whole notion of trying to make it more difficult for people to vote is undemocratic. It goes contrary to the spirit of the Constitution of the United States of America. We should be encouraging people to participate in the process as much as possible, and instituting things like a national holiday for Election Day.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so, so we celebrate the 14th Amendment.
The 14th Amendment
tomorrow, which is the spirit of what we're talking about, but maybe not the execution of it yet as well. And so let's talk a little bit about what's going to happen tomorrow at the Webster Family Resource Center, and the event sponsored by the NAACP.
So we still have tickets, and if your audience still wants to purchase tickets to this particular event, they're $10. If you're in the vicinity of Silva, you can go to City Lights Bookstore. Last time I checked this weekend, they still have tickets to sell. It's show $10. So you get a ticket like this, and as part of the event, there's going to be a show of a salad dinner. So you can, and sometimes you can enjoy fellowship. There's also going to be a silent auction as well, and this is to support the NAACP. Several artists have donated craft work, such as pottery, such as wood material. Some people have donated services. I have donated services. I don't know if your audience knows about this. I am a professor of physics and astronomy at Western Carolina University. I own my own telescope, so for a $50 initial bid, I will host a little star party at your place, or a place that has a dark enough sky, so that you guys
that's a great offer.
Yeah, so you can see the moon, the planets, Jupiter, Saturn, if it's a clear night. Mars is going to be putting out a good show later part of this month. So if you are so interested in that, you come in and show a bid and help the NAACP out as well.
Okay. And we are expecting a good-sized crowd. Again, it starts at 6 o'clock in the
It starts at
evening.
6 o'clock, yes. Says from 6 to 8:30 or so. So the program will have Dr. McRae. She'll give a presentation as well as a chance for question and answer as well.
Okay.
And she'll be talking about her research and the title of the talk that we chosen is foiling the 14th Amendment. So we want to come back to the 14th Amendment as to how, for instance, things have been used in the South and across the country to essentially limit the democratic participation of people into a life of the republic. So that will be the subject.
Okay, well, it sounds great. And for those of you who don't know, the Family Resource Center is the old school, the old rock school in downtown Webster, such as it is.
Yeah, the old Webster School Auditorium, which is now the Family Research Center, is at 1528 Webster Road in Webster.
Okay. Enrique, thank you again,
Absolutely,
and
yes.
we'll be back again. We talked about doing this once a week or so. I don't know
we'll do that.
if we can sustain it. Maybe
We'll
we
see
can.
do that. Shall I just come next week and
That would
see
be
where it
great.
takes it?
That would be
we can do
awesome.
that.
Okay, thank you,
Excellent.
Enrique.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me back.
Okay.